Okay, I'd like to introduce our program chair, Larry Allen, to introduce our program.
Have you I have. Okay, we each get one.
Oh, we each get one, okay.
You've already heard from the speaker who's going to be with us next month, Chris, who just gave us some good news. But she's going to be talking about red tide. So April 11th, put that down and for 7 o'clock here. And I think you'll find it a very interesting program, and including getting some information about what we as individuals can do. Tonight we're really happy to have Dr. Beth Brady with us. She's with the Save the Manatee organization, and she's been studying and researching manatees for over 17 years. And she tells me she does a good manatee sound impression too. So maybe we'll get to hear that as well.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for all that you do. I just started Save the Manatee Club and learning about what they do, so I've been in contact with people from the Sierra Club, so thank you, and thank you for your efforts to conserve the environment. But let's talk about the Florida manatee. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about me and just my background. I didn't start out as a marine biologist. I actually started out as a registered nurse. So I was a registered nurse for a significant period of time. But as you can see from this image, marine mammals were not very far from my heart. So I went back to school and decided I was going to first do a master's degree. I also did some volunteer work at Clearwater Marine Aquarium and did some work there, volunteering my time. And right before I went for my master's degree, I did a 9-month Florida Fish and Wildlife internship where I first got my love of manatees, and then I was hooked. After that, I went for my master's degree to Nova Southeastern University, my PhD at Florida Atlantic University, where I studied manatee vocalization. So that's been the crux of my research. And then I did a 3-year postdoc at Mote Marine Laboratory, where I got to further some of that research. And now I just transitioned to Save the Manatee Club. But those aren't the only animals that I have researched over the past couple of years. I've also looked at North Atlantic right whales. So North Atlantic right whales, you've probably heard a lot about them. Their numbers are actually dwindling. There's about 300 of them, unfortunately, left. They do get struck by boats. But I had the opportunity with a colleague of mine to study their vocalizations as well. And I also attempted alligators, and I love this picture because my husband in the back of the room took this picture. So we wanted to look at the sounds of alligators. They make a mating sound called a bellow, and when they do that, their back shakes and it makes the water move. So we were trying to record these really low frequency signals, and as you can tell, it didn't really work out so well. So we had to put the hydrophone, or the underwater microphone, in a cage, and the alligator treated it like a chew toy. And just ripped my hydrophone in half. So I never got to record those vocalizations. We did it at a captive park, so anytime you put anything in a captive habitat, they are really interested in it, and yeah, they treated it like a chew toy. So just a little bit about Save the Manatee Club. We were established in 1981 by the late Jimmy Buffett, along with Senator Bob Graham, because they wanted to get together and were dedicated to safeguarding manatees and their habitat. So what does Save the Manatee Club do? We increase public awareness and education. We fund rescue, research, rehabilitation, and release of manatees. We advocate, just like you do, for strong protection measures and take legal action when appropriate. And we work all across the world. So we work with the Wide Caribbean, South America, and Africa. So what's a manatee, right? I'm sure a lot of you, if you're Floridians, you are probably familiar with the manatee. They are marine mammals, they breathe air. But here's a really interesting fact. Do you know that they've been on this planet longer than we have? They've been on this earth about 50 million years. Compare that to humans, who have been on this earth for about 2 million years. So these guys have been on earth for a very long period of time. So where are manatees found? They're found in shallow, slow-moving bodies of water. They're found in fresh, marine, and brackish environments, and they particularly like fresh water, so they physiologically need fresh water to drink. So they'll travel to those places, but they're mostly found in shallow water habitats, mostly because that's where their aquatic vegetation is found. And manatees are the infamous snowbirds, right? They don't tolerate waters lower than 68 degrees. So when the water temperatures get cold, they get what's called cold stress, or like hypothermia in humans. So what they do is they'll come down to Florida and they'll seek those warm refuges, mainly in springs or power plants, which put out artificially warm water. So here's the cool part that I like. This is the manatee brain, and this will get you into some of the senses that the manatee has, and then we'll talk a little bit about the work that I do. So if you look at the brain, first thing you notice it's really sweet is it's flat. There's no ridges in it. Our brains have ridges in it. It's supposed to be an indicator of intelligence. Do you think manatees are dumb? No. So manatees are related to elephants. And what do we know about elephants? Elephants never what? Exactly. So manatees have to travel sometimes really long distances to find that warm water refuge. And they do this in turbid water. So their vision is the smallest part of the brain right there. It's really small, right? So their vision isn't that great. They don't have fine visual acuity like you and I do. They can see colors, blues and greens and really bright colors, but it's really not much of use to them when they're in those turbid waters. Look at the somatic sensory, large. So manatees have vibrissae on their face and on their back. They have 3,000 hairs, and they think those hairs can be used to detect changes in environment, changes in temperature, changes in currents, and maybe even detect other animals. But the largest part there, what I'm really interested in, is the auditory portion. It's huge. So this is going to tell us that vocalizations and hearing are quite important to manatees. And their hearing's actually better than ours. They can hear from 500 hertz up to 96 kilohertz into ultrasonic frequency range. They have really phenomenal hearing. So this leads me to manatee communications, what's my bread and butter. So I wanted to know, well, if they have these brains that are really large in the auditory region, what kind of sounds do they make? There wasn't really not a lot known about manatee vocalizations. So one of the first things I did, and this is one from my very first publication, was looking at the types of sounds that manatees make. So I found that there were 5 different call types. You have a squeak, which is the most predominant call type that manatee use, the hill-shaped high squeak, which I'm talking about in just a little bit, the squeak squeal, which is a combination of a squeak and a noisy sounding call called a squeal, which is right here, and a chirp. I play it for you. This is where I'll do my best impression for you. So people, when they usually hear it, it sounds like a high-pitched mouse. They are usually astonished that such a high-pitched vocalization comes from such a large animal. So you may know there's not just the Florida manatee, we have a couple of different species of manatee. So I have some images of them for you here. So the Florida manatee is under the West Indian species. So you have the Antillean, which is dispersed throughout the Caribbean, and you have our infamous Florida manatee. You also have the African manatee, which is here, and then you have the Amazonian manatee, which you see in the upper right. And we'll talk about them and their vocalizations in just a minute here. And we also have the Antillean, like I said, in the lower left. So I was curious. So I was wondering, yes?
Just on that map, so are dugongs just a different species in the same genus?
They are a species, but they're over in the Indo-Pacific. They are related. Unfortunately, I didn't have any vocalizations for them, but they actually span over 40 different countries. They're really interesting to look at because they're very distinct from manatees. They have a tail like a dolphin and a very downward-facing snout. So when I talk about manatees and I talk about dugongs, their mouths are situated just slightly differently. But dugongs are the most interesting because their mouths are very ventral, meaning they can only eat at the bottom of the water column. Manatees can eat the top, middle, or the bottom. They can eat emergent stuff top, they can eat in the middle, and on the bottom chew seagrass. But not dugongs. They can only eat at the bottom of the water column. And when they eat, they pull up everything, including the roots. You can actually know where a dugong's been feeding because they leave feeding trails. And by the width of that feeding trail, you can tell how large the animal is. But yeah, they're fascinating. So one of the questions I was curious about is, well, do manatees in different geographic locations sound different? So think about it. I bet you know the difference from someone from Australia than here, right? What about even in the United States? I bet you know the difference from someone from New York and someone from the South. So it makes sense. We're still speaking English, but we might sound slightly different from one another. What about manatees? And the short answer to this is, yes, they are slightly different. they produce very similar calls. So we recorded calls from manatees in Belize and Panama and Florida. And what we found is they were made very similar call types, but they were slightly different in pitch. Now, Florida manatees are fat and chunky, right? So they were lower in frequency. Think of a larger animal, they're definitely going to be lower in frequency, a lower pitch as compared to like an elephant to a mouse. A mouse is really small, more high-pitched frequencies, and elephants large, more lower frequencies. Panama was in the middle, and Belize was the highest. So why are these two different subspecies? So Antillean is the Belize and Panama. They're very similar. Why would they be different? Well, we think it may be due to geographic differences. So I want you to think about if you're talking when you're in a cave or when you're talking when you're in the desert. Your voice sounds slightly different depending on that habitat, right? Your voice is echoing in a cave, but it sounds slightly different when you're in the desert, right? So we think habitat may definitely play a role in why their vocalizations are different. And like I said, Belize and Panama, they're slightly different in body size. They're a little bit smaller than the Florida manatee, so it makes sense that their vocalizations would be a little bit higher in pitch. But what about the African manatees? This is the African manatee on the left. Their eyes are just slightly different, just a little bit, and their mouth is a little bit more ventrally located than the Florida manatee, which you see on the right. So we did a study on this. African manatee vocalizations look just like Florida manatee vocalizations. So we did this study, they did a trial. They just put this hydrophone out, or an underwater microphone out for 3 days in this place called Lake Asa, just to see, can we record manatee vocalizations? And they sure did. We recorded over 3,000 vocalizations. But the interesting thing was, we recorded these mostly at night. So why at night? So a couple of different reasons here. One, they're still preyed upon by humans in Africa. But two, we think this may be just what manatees do. Maybe they forage, or they're in places they kind of eat a lot more at night than they do during the day. So during the day, Florida manatees, they'll kind of go to their safe spot, they'll drink, and then they'll go out usually at night to forage and to feed. And we're starting to see this trend not just here, but also with the Antillean subspecies. Amazonian manatee on the left. They're the smallest of the manatee species. They're completely freshwater, and they're with the smallest in body size, and they have that nice demarcation on their bellies, which is unique to each individual, which is a new fact that I learned not too long ago. What about their vocalizations? So they look very similar to manatee vocalizations, but Florida manatee vocalizations, but the difference is they have what's called notes, right? So instead of this one line straight across, we have a little note here, a little note here, they're kind of broken up just a little bit. We think that might have to do with the age of the animal. This seems to disappear when they get a little bit older. But what about manatee calves? So this is interesting. So manatee calves stay with their mom for about 1.5 to 2 years. They're about 4 feet long when they're born. They are made by a mating herd, so you have one female being chased by sometimes two, mostly more, group of males. They usually give birth to one calf at a time. Twins are rare, about 5% of the population. And during the time that they stay with mom, they usually learn where those warm water refuges are and where they can go feed and all that good stuff that manatees know. So what about their vocalizations? What about calves? And this is the really fascinating part. So that high squeak, that hill-shaped call I told you about, those are actually produced by very young calves. And as the calves get older, that hill shape starts to flatten out and become a more adult-like squeak. So what I'm showing you here is the body size of a calf. These are each individual calls from individual animals with the length of the animal up top. So as you can see, as individuals get longer in size, their vocalizations go from a hill shape to more flat. So why would that be important? Why do we care? So unlike Florida, most of these places in the Caribbean, their waters are warmer a lot of the time, and they don't tend to aggregate in these large numbers that we see in Florida. So you can put a hydrophone in the water, and not only will you know if a manatee's there, but you'll also know whether or not you have a calf present, particularly a young calf, because once they reach about 1 year of age is approximately when you get the hill shape goes to a more flattened shape. So what are some of the challenges that Florida manatees face? So from 2020, and we're still going on till 2024, there's an unusual mortality event. So on the east coast of Florida, we had a series of harmful algal blooms that basically took out and decimated over 80% of the seagrass. Right? So this caused a lot of manatees to come up emaciated because they didn't know where to go to seagrass. We lost approximately 1,500 animals over the past couple of years, and we're still losing animals. However, we are seeing some rejuvenation. Some seagrass is coming back in some of these areas. So we are currently working with some of our partners to reduce some of these seagrasses and replant some seagrasses. Oops, is that where I want to go? Yeah. So where are manatees at today? So the death rate has significantly slowed down, and this past year, Florida Fish and Wildlife did aerial surveys. So they do aerial surveys, usually every year in an airplane, to estimate the abundance of animals, of Florida manatees, right? So when you saw those numbers over years past, those numbers are the minimum estimates of the population. When they do an aerial survey, you're not going to be able to count every animal. Not every animal is going to be in the warm water refuge at the same time. Right? So that's always the minimum estimate. So they changed their methods a little bit this past year. They're doing a new statistical method. They want to be more precise, right? So their estimate that they came up with was 6,000 to 10,000 animals in the population. We're all like, that's interesting. So basically they're going to take that number and they're going to put it into another model to get a more reliable estimate of the number of manatees in the population. So there's a lot of different factors, like I said, that go into actually determining the number of manatees that are in the population currently. So they haven't done that quite yet. They just have this very broad estimate, but I wouldn't take that to, that's just the range. So it could be anywhere in the low end from 6,000 up to 10 or 12,000, right? So that still remains to be seen exactly quite where we are. So one of the things I was interested in was the body condition of these animals. What do these animals look like? So what they usually do every year is they capture individual animals. They'll capture about 15 animals and they'll look at their overall body condition. And I thought, well, isn't there a better way that we can look at more animals and get a better sense of their body condition? So one of the ways researchers have been doing this is using drones. They've been using drones on whales and seals, flying them in the air to look at their overall body condition. And since manatees aggregate, wouldn't this be a really good thing? So this just gives you a general indication of people are worried about, well, are you going to be, is that going? It's not going yet. Are you going to disturb the animals? Well, here's the boat doing photo ID, and hopefully I can play this for you, and it works. All those disturbance response, all those things, all those little splurts there, those are all manatees being disturbed from the boat. And we're still flying over 100 meters in the air, not causing any disturbance to the animals whatsoever. So this is about, we saw this many animals. This is the view we got from Cape Canaveral Energy Center. This was the first year that they actually were doing the feeding of the manatees over there. So this is some of the imagery that we were taking from the manatees at the surface during that time from the drone. So what else can we do with this drone imagery? We can do photo ID, photo identification of these animals. So these are some of the scarred individuals that we saw. So photo identification is used to identify manatees from year to year. Unfortunately, manatees get hit by boats and they leave these scar patterns, and these scar patterns are used to identify individuals. From the drone, we could get some images that we might be able to use to identify to see who was there. You can also use it to look at tagged individuals. So Florida Fish and Wildlife, along with United States Geological Survey, tagged individual animals. They wanted to know where are these animals going to forage for food, and they wanted to track their movement since there was a lack of food in there. But they don't get to monitor them all the time, and these tags send GPS satellite signals, and if the buoy goes under the water, you can't really track the animal very well. So they still wanted to know where were they. So from this one drone image, you can see there's 5 animals with tags in this image. So we can tell Florida Fish and Wildlife and USGS, we see your animals here on this day. So that was helpful for them. Counting manatees. So this is an aerial survey like we did. So my colleague overlaid these 1,164 animals. So we can count the abundance of animals really easily in a confined area. So the airplanes, so we can do this at a much lower altitude and be able to get a reliable estimate of the number of animals in a location. And last but not least, we can look at the body condition of these animals. So what we are trying to do is determine to rate them from a scale of 1 to 5 of how healthy these animals are, with 1 very skinny, has like a peanut-shaped head, to number 5. So I can give you a little bit of background of what we found so far. So we did this for the animals on the East Coast and for animals on the West Coast. We did have some measurements directly from the animals in Crystal River. And Crystal River is they're usually very plump, very healthy animals. So we got a body condition index of the animals in Crystal River at 0.32. Okay, that's pretty good. What about the animals on the East Coast? 0.23. Decrease, right? However, you have to take this with a grain of salt, because manatees can be different bodies and different body widths depending on the habitat that they're in. So, is it because the animals on the West Coast are just bigger in general? And they are a little bit bigger. Or is it because of this unusual mortality event? So what we're doing now is we're working with our partners, Florida Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. We have data from this past year. So we're going to compare from year to year, right, to see if their body condition changed over time. I literally just got approval today to fly in Blue Spring State Park. You might have heard of, they had over 900 manatees. So now we can compare between subpopulations, and we can get a baseline. And when we take that baseline, we can look at their change in body condition from year to year to let us know what the health is, if not just 15 animals, but 1,000 animals or even more on the East Coast and the West Coast. So manatees and boats, and I talked about this just a little bit. Yes, manatees do get hit by boats. And people are like, well, don't they know how to get out of the way? Interesting thing, this is an acoustic thing. So manatees only have 6 vertebrae, most animals have 7, which means they can't turn their head like this. They can always say yes, but they can't say no. So that makes it difficult. If you've been in the ocean and you hear sound, can you always localize where it's coming from? No, most of the time it's really difficult, especially if it's coming from far away. So now imagine you have the ability to do this to figure out where it's coming from. Manatees have to do this, right? So if there's a boat coming from behind them, it's hard for them to localize where the sound is coming from. Plus, if the person's going fast, it makes it doesn't give them a lot of time to get out of the way. So one of the things we like to stress is manatee protection zones. If you see those manatee protection zones, you want to make sure you're going that idle speed, very slow speed, so you give the chance for manatees to get out of the way. The other thing people are like, what about prop guards? So prop guards can be good if you're going idle speed. If you think that you're comfortable, like, oh, I have a prop guard, I'm not going to hit the manatee, and you're still going fast, that is like another blunt force object that could potentially cause an impact to the animal. So that's the issue that we have. We don't discourage prop guards, but if you're not going to obey the slow speed zones, you're probably still going to wind up hurting the animal, and you have another method to hurt the animal other than just the front of the boat. Cold stress, which we talked about a little bit, similar to hypothermia in humans. So they have to stay in their warm water refuges, and they'll have to go out and forage to feed it sometimes. Sometimes they'll get caught when it gets really cold, and they get these lesions that you see in this animal right here. It particularly is mostly younger animals because they have a smaller body size and they are more prone to cold stress. And red tide, which you're going to hear about next week, it's a naturally occurring dinoflagellate, and unfortunately us as humans, we like to put nitrogen and phosphorus that fuels these algal blooms and cause these red tide. Red tide's like a manatee's kryptonite. Manatees have really robust immune systems. I've seen some animals come back with some really significant scarring, and sometimes we don't know if they're going to make it. This one lady they just released, I think her name was Reckless. She had this really bad boat strike, and she still miraculously came back, was able to be released back in the wild with her child. But red tide is like a manatee's kryptonite. So if it gets on the seagrass or if they breathe it, it causes neurotoxins, which can cause them to have seizures, and unfortunately they can't maintain their buoyancy and they drown. Trash. So they actually have found microplastics in manatees, also in humans, right? But they also farm trash and manatees, microplastics. They get entangled sometimes in monofilament, can wrap around the flippers, so that can be a problem for manatees as well. And then aquatic habitat loss. So this is the hugest thing that I was talking about with the UME, right? Loss of seagrass. We're seeing that everywhere. I was just in Fort Myers this morning talking to a gentleman who they had lost a lot of their seagrass there too in Collier County. So we have really big concerns about this population and what's going to happen with manatees over time, particularly for females for reproductive efforts. If you don't have food, how can you produce the next generation of manatees? The other thing we're worried about is artificial power plants. So there's been some legislation that's been going through. It's saying we need to switch from fossil fuels to renewable fuels. How are we going to do this with artificial power plants that manatees depend on? Some of these power plants, like I said, the one at Cape Canaveral Energy Center, 1,200 manatees are there and use that power plant. It takes them some time until they learn where the next warm water source is. So how do we remedy this? So one of the things I also did with drones was using drones to look at seagrass, right? So you can take images of the seagrass. So what the drone will do, it's called autonomous flying, right? And so you'll go over a very small area and it'll fly over these seagrass, and it takes very multiple and many pictures, and sometimes 400 images, sometimes up to 800 images. This gives you an idea of how many images it takes, and that's just 2 of one small area. So this is an area that we did. Here, I'll back up so I went a little fast. So these are some images, and then you get this whole area. So we did this really whole area, and we wanted to look at and see how much did the seagrass change over time and do fluctuations. So normally the water management districts, along with Florida Fish and Wildlife, monitor the seagrass beds. The water management districts do it by aerial survey every 2 years. What about in between? So we wanted to know what the fluctuations were during a year. So we did this once a month for about a year. We found there is some variability in those fluctuations in seagrass over the course of time, over the course of just 1 year. So what this drone can do, it's obviously a lot easier to do an aerial survey, because just an area this size will take me about 45 minutes, and that's about 1,100 square feet. So what we can do is we can focus on smaller patches of seagrass, maybe key areas, and we can determine how the health of the seagrass is doing just by some of these smaller key locations, and maybe go into areas that the airplane can't really see very well. So rescue and rehab. So one of the problems during the UME is we had lack of rehab facilities to take all the animals that need to be rescued. And since then, there has been an expansion of rehab facilities willing to take on animals, and there's new facilities coming online every day. Save the Manatee Club helps financially sponsor and care for some of these animals. If you go to our website, we actually also sponsor animals outside of the country, where you can buy formula and all kinds of good things for those animals, particularly in the South America area. Tracking, I talked about that a little bit. We help with tracking manatees. So orphan calves usually get tracked for about a year. So orphan calves have to come into rehab. They stay there for about a year. They have to get about to be 600 pounds before they get released. But they track them for about a year and make sure they're being manatees. We just did a huge release up in Crystal River with our partners. And so they put those tags on them, and the Clearwater Marine Aquarium will follow them and just make sure they're being manatees. Sometimes they need to be re-rescued. Younger, really young cats who haven't been with their mom for a significant period of time are much greater risk, because they haven't been with mom for long enough to learn about those warm water refuges. But they release them most of the time in the winter so that they can find other manatees and follow other manatees around to find where all those good warm water is, as well as food sources. So how can you help manatees? So boating tips, you probably already know this. If you're out in the water, wear polarized sunglasses. It helps you see under the water. Don't try to track the manatee to your boat. Sometimes I know you have to use fresh water to hose off your boat. The manatees really seem to like that. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but try not to do it if you can. And if you're paddling in a kayak, if you see a manatee, you want to keep your distance away from them, keep your paddle out of the water. This probably goes without saying, but sometimes we have to tell this to people, don't disturb them. We don't really recommend that you swim with manatees, and particularly don't touch them. We don't want to habituate them to human presence, and I guess this really much goes for any wild animal. We don't want to habituate them to human presence. So be their voice. If you can see an injured manatee, you can call Florida Fish and Wildlife. That's their hotline. They've been very busy picking up a lot of manatees as of late. We also offer free resources. If you go to that website, we offer a multitude of resources that you can use to educate or take into classrooms or take into your individual community. Make sure you stash your trash. I think that's common sense, so we don't want manatees to eat the trash that's in the environment. You can donate your time. You can come volunteer with us. We have volunteers pretty much all over the United States who help with manatee outreach events. We really appreciate our volunteers. And you can join our email alert action team. I'm pretty sure probably Sierra Club has one of those too, that when we have an issue that we're concerned about, we have you email the senators and commissioners in your area if you want to get something on their agenda or try to push something we feel like is important. Or you could send us a sighting. If you have a phone, you can take a picture of a manatee and send it to us, and that way we can track where manatees are, particularly during summer months. Sometimes it's hard to figure out where these guys go during the summer, where are they located. They do have the aerial survey counts on a website, but you gotta keep in mind that's only during winter. Where do they go during the summer? So it's important for us to know that information too, what spots are important for manatees during summer months. Try to be fertilizer free. A lot of fertilizers have that nitrogen and phosphorus that go into the ocean to help fuel those harmful algal blooms. So you can also keep grass clippings out of streets and conserve water by irrigating your lawn only when necessary. Last, I think this is last, you can also adopt a manatee if you like for $25. I guess that's, and we track them in Blue Springs State Park, so you can see your manatee over time. You can let them know when they're there.